I'm going to start. I'm not going to give you a great, big, long introduction about Louis, although he is a very distinguished young man. He's only, 27?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, 27 years old. He has his own... he's a captain in the U.S. Army. Major captain?
No. I left right before.
Did you? Okay, fair enough. He's been in the U.S. Army anyway as an officer. He has his own clothing brand, and he is a really serious budding historian now that I think we've all got to listen to, because he's written this fabulous book, really generally and genuinely excellent piece of historical research on the importance to Napoleon Bonaparte of the literary life. And the first question is the obvious and classic one that everybody gets asked. What gave you the idea to write this book?
Well, thank you, dear shows. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, it's a bit of a niche undertaking. My focus was specifically on Napoleon's love of the written word, the influences that his many readings had on him. And so the first question is naturally why. Thank you. There's multiple reasons. One, I must admit to you, I'm a gigantic nerd about Napoleon. And so that seemed like a fascinating aspect to sort of delve into. But there's also a more fundamental reason. And maybe some of you may share that view with me. But growing up, I was somewhat of a reader. And a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people in my family often told me, sort of put that down and go actually do something. Sort of opposing reading and action, as if the greatest readers in history were not the greatest men of action. There was some sort of opposition between these two things. And I had always sensed that was nonsense. That could not have been true, but was never truly able to articulate it until I stumbled upon the works of Lord Roberts, amongst others, in which it was revealed to me that Napoleon Bonaparte was not only perhaps the greatest man of action in human history, the great reformer, the great military genius, the great civil mind, but also one of the most expansive readers. So that was the kind of the mission I set for myself and for the book, is to forever get rid of that age-old insult and to show that lesser-known facet of his character.
And he starts writing early on, doesn't he? He
Yes.
writes essays, famous one about how he lost his virginity to a prostitute in the Palais Royal.
That's right.
And there's a lot of chatting they tended to do,
Yes.
him and the prostitute. Then he wrote Clisson and Eugenie,
Yes.
a love story. He wrote essays on the liberty of Corsica, and including a couple of very, very gory ones.
Yes.
And then he also, of course, went into that competition, the famous competition. So tell us about his early writings.
Sure. So as a teenager, and maybe in this way he was certainly similar to me and to a lot of young men in the world, he was desperate to become a writer. The problem is that he was not a very good one. He tried his hand first writing some essays, as you mentioned. He tries to write an essay about the time he lost his virginity to a prostitute in the Palais Royal. I'm sad to announce to you, ladies and gentlemen, we don't know if the act was finally christened at the end. He just tells us about the conversation, the opening talk. So in a way, focusing on the wrong part of the event, but nonetheless, he attempted. He also wrote an essay, very verbose, very teenagey, hormone-filled document about committing suicide. He's 16 or 17 at the time. He's quite depressed. He had a very bad day at his military academy in Paris. He gets home and he says, "Oh, what will happen the next time I see a carriage in the street? Surely I shall not get out of its way." And of course, Napoleon does not commit suicide and goes on to enter history as we know him. So there's definite period in his life where he attempts to become a writer. After the essays, he tries more serious works, including his most serious and perhaps best, which is Clisson and Eugenie. It's a short novel. Very, very heavily plagiarized from other Enlightenment literature, especially Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a huge fan of Rousseau's work and plagiarized them in many ways. Clisson and Eugenie is the story of a very poorly disguised, very brave, very good-looking young military officer. We might guess who his inspiration was, who falls deathly in love with this wonderful young woman, is called away to war, goes to war, is wounded in war, sends his aide-de-camp, his second-in-command, to tell Eugenie. And for reasons passing understanding, Eugenie cheats on Clisson with the officer. Clisson learns of this, is heartbroken, rushes into the fray, dies, and the novel ends. That was the extent of Napoleon's literary talents. It's a very confusing and verbose document. Nonetheless, it's very interesting because that is before Napoleon really sets the plume down and picks up the sword. It's when, at the time of his life, he didn't really know what he was going to do with himself. And he very seriously considers becoming a writer. And I think, thank God for European history that he did not. And that he went on to do the things that we know and love him for.
One of which is to invade Egypt. And you dedicate an entire chapter of this book to the Egyptian campaign. Why was that so important?
So my argument is a simple one. He invades Egypt. He sails the Mediterranean with the largest fleet ever known to man at the time. He's in his late 20s. It's a surreal and exceptional episode at any period in history, specifically that one. But what makes it even more interesting is not only that he brings along the soldiers and the logistic people and the sailors, but he brings on over 200 philosophers, cartographers, botanists, biologists, antiquarians, historians, philosophers, poets. People that he wanted to bring along with him, not only to serve in his colonial purposes, and by the way, that was fully one of the considerations for him, we must not lie about it, but also because he wanted this to be an Enlightenment venture. Now the question is why? Why did this guy in his late 20s, who's at this point is very committed to a military career, chooses to bring along all these people? Now I would argue that it's because he read so much and was fascinated by Alexander the Great, especially reading Plutarch's Lives and Arrian's description of Alexander. And what did Alexander do when he conquered Egypt? He brought along 200 philosophers. And Napoleon wanted to live up to his idol, also brought along his 200 philosophers. And I go on to talk about the creation of the Institut d'Égypte, of course, which is this surreal moment, not only in Napoleonic, but in world history, when you have these very awkward, very intelligent savants discussing, out of any room they could have chosen, the former room of the harem of the Mamluk Bey, the flight potential of ostriches, the ability to make beer in Egypt, right? Dissecting the various lizards and insects of the African continent. Right? So, and this is all because of Napoleon. If it wasn't him, if Menou was in charge of the expedition, or Kléber, we know what their feelings were towards these savants. In fact, many of the soldiers were hostile to them. And their impact, by the way, the savants' impact, is immense. They basically unlock Egypt for the world. I mean, the first printed documents are made there, the first maps, the first serious maps, the first discovery of all the great monuments that we can visit today, and of course the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which, as you all know, will later lead to the unlocking of the hieroglyphs. So the impact of the expedition, the intellectual impacts, are immense and much greater than the military or the political impacts, because on the military side of things, as you know, the only lasting legacy was that it cemented Egypt as a British protectorate. I think we may all agree, a great catastrophe.
It's a great happy ending there. And of course, Vivant Denon writes, or at least edits, this 26-volume description of Egypt, which still stands as one of the great intellectual sort of pillars of
Yes.
the century, and it's dedicated to Napoleon the Great.
Yes.
And by Denon, and although it wasn't finally finished until after Napoleon's death, without the sort of sense of what Napoleon was trying to do, none of this would have happened.
Of course. And that book is part of why the description de l'Egypte, I mean, that particular book which popularized the Egyptian expedition, is why we all know that particular episode so well. And it's part of why I argue that Napoleon's legacy is not only political, civil, and military, it's also literary. Right? It's because of that book that so many of these things were popularized. It's because of that book that started in Europe about a century of what we call today Egyptomania, a fascination with all things Egyptian. The first mummy novels, for example, were published in the aftermath of the Egyptian expedition. The fact that we have an obelisk as the Washington Monument, we also have one in Paris. The Dallas Medical Building is another testament to the architectural influences of the Egyptian expedition. But even more than that, were we to walk around Paris 50, 60, 70 years after the expedition, we would see women wearing Egyptian perfumes. We would see lotus flowers and Egyptian hairstyles. So the impact is absolutely massive, and it's made not because of a military or political achievement, but because of this intellectual leaning and his love of reading and culture that he had and he brought with him.
And another important area of his writing were, of course, his love letters.
Yes.
Love letters to Josephine, extremely graphic at times, pretty erotic at other times. It was he obviously was, one of the great love letter writers, wasn't he?
He was, absolutely. I recall one particular, I hope there's not anybody under 18 in this room. There's one particular passage, he tells Josephine, I will be home in 3 days, do not wash. So we can only dream of receiving something like this today. Unfortunately, so little of us do. These letters, of course, are a mainstay on any Napoleonic reading list, and I invite you all, after you've purchased my book and Andrew's book, to purchase a volume of these wonderful letters.
But you must get the latest edition, because throughout the 19th century, the earlier editions were so heavily and indeed into the 20th century, so heavily Bowdlerized that all you get is a series of very anodyne statements.
Yeah, get the raunchy ones. They're the ones that matter, and they're the ones that are best to read. Mm. So the interesting thing about these letters is that if one pays close attention to what Napoleon the teenager had been reading, one finds a string of novels, of epistolary novels, most notably Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's Paul and Virginie, and also Jean-Jacques Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse, where you find not exactly word for word, but very, very similar letters. And in fact, we know that Napoleon in Egypt had both those novels with him. And so I argue and postulate that much of his letters, although they are completely, honest and authentic to himself and very much describe his character, very emotional, very jealous character, in love at least that is, they were also heavily influenced by his readings. In fact, there's a letter, I believe it's from Madame de Rémusat, who knew the imperial couple, and it's written about those letters to Josephine. And Madame de Rémusat describes the letter and says something along the lines of, you must read Napoleon's letters to Josephine. They are so disorderly, they are so full of passion, there's no structure to them, it is just raw emotion. And so in my research, I remember reading that passage, and a couple minutes later, stumbled upon Rousseau's own description of his writing style in his novel. And he says, the order has to be disorderly, it has to be raw passion, it has to be all emotion. And so clearly, I think there was definitely some interplay going on, and some Rousseauan influence is to be found in Napoleon's
and there's also, letters. Isn't there, a real example of life imitating art. Because, of course, in Clisson and Eugénie, you do have the unfaithful wife.
Yes.
And that is exactly what is happening to Napoleon when Josephine is sleeping with the cavalry lieutenant.
Correct.
And he has the inevitable reaction of fury and nearly breaking up with her.
Yes.
And then not when he gets back from Egypt. And the whole thing is a massive sexual maelstrom, which can be seen in the letters.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, he does not, for those of you who have seen Sir Ridley Scott's horrendous recent movie, he does not return from Egypt because of the adultery, although he did learn that she was being adulterous with Hippolyte Charles, the young hussar, while in Egypt. He goes back for political reasons, obviously. If there's one thing you go away from this talk with, ladies and gentlemen, it is this. The only thing that mattered to Napoleon, his religion, everything he obsessed about was politics. He was not a normal human being who was able to compartmentalize and have a balanced life instead of work. No. With him, it was an obsession over politics. It can explain almost all of his acts, and it's why he returns from Egypt.
Ridley Scott's movie is 3 hours, 27 minutes long, and the accurate bits are the 27 minutes.
Yeah, it's 3 hours, 27 minutes too long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're talking about his reading and the intellectual influences on him. Goethe, of course, comes out as a tremendously important one as well.
Yes.
And Goethe admired him and thought of him as the Enlightenment on horseback, and was a sort of believer in the idea of Napoleon, admired him. And of course, they meet on, I think, 2 occasions.
Yes.
Tell us about Napoleon and Goethe.
Sure. So Napoleon had read perhaps the greatest novel in European history, The Sorrows of Young Werther. And Napoleon, like much other people who read the book, especially of his generation, adored the text and really held Goethe as one of his literary icons. But the difference with Rousseau is that Napoleon divorces Rousseau at some point and sort of moves on and no longer reads him, but stays with Goethe his entire life. And the two meet in a surreal and unfortunately lesser known episode of the Napoleonic epic. They meet twice, once in the governor's palace in Erfurt during the Treaty of Tilsit. And there's this surreal exchange. Goethe writes all of this to a friend years later, of course, but we nonetheless have a reason to trust his testimony. He's ushered into a room where Napoleon is sitting with various of his ministers. Napoleon stands up, rushes up to Goethe immediately, and almost like a fanboy, starts barraging him with questions. Did you read Voltaire's play, Mohammed? Isn't it a terrible play? Why don't you write such a play yourself? Do you have children? How old are you? You look very well preserved. It's a very awkward conversation. And nonetheless, Goethe comes away with that conversation and says that he had never met a reader who better understood the sorrows of young Werther. Now, Werther is an incredibly intellectual work, very, very deep, many layers. To this day on literary syllabuses, very, very heavily discussed and debated. So for Werther to say that Napoleon had understood it better, and in fact made comments on possible revisions for future editions, that says something about Napoleon's depth of culture and literary understanding. I mean, this was not just a guy who liked to read once in a while. This is a man who had thought incredibly deeply about these subjects. And it's made all the more amazing because he was also leading armies in the field and creating the modern French state. So let that be a lesson to all of you. I don't know if any of you have had friends who say, I'm sorry, I wish I could read, I simply don't have the time. Well, I don't think that excuse survives the exposure to Napoleon Bonaparte.
He also wrote 33,000 letters. The Correspondence, which has just been finally published in full by the Fondation.
And those are 30,000 letters, ladies and gentlemen, that survive. Right.
Yeah.
So in the early months of 1807, at the height of the reign, he averages over 17 letters a day, which is about twice as much as what Donald Trump tweeted during his presidency. Right? And this was a known tweeter. And letter writing taking much more effort and much more time.
Actually, Napoleon would have been great on Twitter.
Yes.
Because he was able to compress his thoughts into 280 characters or fewer very easily.
Absolutely.
And one of the things, I'm reading the letters for a book I'm writing at the moment, and one of the interesting things about those letters is that, yes, of course, he would use it a bit like email in that there'd be, many of them would just be 2 sentences to a marshal to take troops from A to B, for example. But others would be much longer. They would be 3,000 words long, and they would be to his brothers, teaching them how to rule countries and giving them pieces of advice about absolutely everything. And then occasionally he would there'd be lots of finger wagging and telling a prefect in Genoa to stop taking his mistress to the opera and things like that. And he was unbelievable micromanager in extraordinary, which explains, doesn't it, the sheer number of these letters.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was the world's most obnoxious micromanager. I mean, of the 30,000 letters that survive, I think we count 400 or 500 that only concern the army's coat buttons. Another 200 concern only socks. Yeah. So in many ways...
Shoes are a good 1,000.
Shoes and boots, absolutely. So in many ways, it was insufferable for his subordinates. But us, as supporters who don't have to endure him on a regular basis, we can just stand in awe of that literary output and also of the breadth of his mind. I mean, how many other world monarchs or leaders of armies focused on such minute details? And for him, that was all-encompassing. He immersed himself in every detail of his armies and of his empire. And I think that's part of the why, it partly explains, rather, the immense successes he reached, at least in the beginning.
But let's also talk about the disaster at the end, because, of course, he spends the last 6 years of his life on St. Helena, and there writes the second biggest bestseller of the 19th century, the Memoirs of St. Helena. It's sort of co-written by him and Emmanuel Lascaz, and it goes on to begin, apart from Uncle Tom's Cabin, it sells more than any other book of the 19th century. And what is he trying to do there?
Sure. So the Memorial of Las Casas, the Memorial of St. Helena, is the last Napoleonic battle. And it is the one fought against posterity. Napoleon knows that his empire is no more, and what remains is the empire of the mind. It's a very conscious decision to write a lasting memorial that will forever cement his legacy, or build a legacy that did not exist in reality but would now exist in the empire of the mind. And it's a complete success. The memorial, I invite all of you to read it. It's not exactly meant to be read as a single book. It's more a catalog of everything Napoleon does with very deep political and philosophical tangents while on St. Helena. And at the very end of his life, it's really the thing that mattered the most, and it's part of why I argue that his legacy is a literary one. Because the battles and the empire having done their job and then disappeared, it's the book that stands as a testament, and it's the book really that is the creating act of the political movement later known as Bonapartism, which is very different from the way he actually governed, but nonetheless is the product of the memorial. So the memorial is a work of memory, it's a work of legacy, and it's the final victory.
It's not the only book he writes on St. Helena, though, is it? Because he also writes the book about Caesar's wars, the Gallic campaign.
This is a wonderful little text, yes. And Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the greatest military and martial minds in human history, writes a commentary of the famous wars of Julius Caesar, perhaps the other great conqueror and leader in world history. And it's incredibly petty. He revered Caesar, and he was incredibly fond of him, but there's so many funny passages, and you can almost see the bitter and aging and obese Napoleon. So there's a passage where Caesar says in his Gallic Wars, I crossed the Rhine at this point, and we did it in 14 days. And then there's an addendum, and Napoleon Bonaparte, former emperor of the French, says, I did it in half the time. It's like, dude, you don't have to compare yourself to Julius Caesar, but he did. I mean, it's part of it. I mean, that really speaks about his character. I mean, how surreal it must have been after having essentially governed the world to be stuck on that little island. He was definitely fighting some mental demons.
Yeah. I've been to that island. You want to get off it after 3 days,
yeah.
Let alone five or 6 years. It will be absolutely soul-destroying. But let's delve deeper into this idea of Caesar, because obviously he reads a great deal about Caesar, especially as a schoolboy, and Alexander the Great.
Yes.
You mentioned Alexander and what Alexander did, bringing savants to Egypt, bringing, in this case, philosophers to Egypt. How much time do you think Napoleon actively thought of himself as a man as great as the ancients?
The whole time.
Yeah, I agree.
The absolute whole time. It's very evident in his declarations to the army. He tells them of ancient battles and ancient Roman legions and Greek phalanxes, knowing perfectly well that most of his soldiers were unable to tell him what those things actually were and what those battles were and who those armies were. But he did it for posterity. He did it for himself. Napoleon, I think, got at least some of his ambition from his early readings as a young man of history. He read Cornelius Nepos, he read Plutarch's Lives, which he loved and adored and followed him his whole life. He read Tacitus, he read Livy, he read Suetonius, all of the great authors of antiquity, and of course was absolutely fascinated by the great conquerors, the great captains, Caesar and specifically Alexander. And I don't know if there's any parents here, I assume they are, but just to give you a little image of how much that ambition was first instilled in him. When he was a young cadet at the military school of Brienne, completely unknown to the world, in fact more Corsican than French, spoke with the very accent, was a victim of bullying. His mother was the butt of remarks about her alleged infidelity with the Comte de Marbeuf. He did not get along with his other pupils. And so during one very poignant episode, the monks at Brienne, the teachers, gave each student a small plot of land that they could cultivate to teach them the rudiments of agriculture. And Napoleon planted foliage in a square and sat in the middle reading alone. He created a little reading habitat, right? Now if that's not a cry for help of a little bullied kid who just wants to get away, and of course, what does he read? He reads the things that temporarily, puts him the furthest away from where he is. He reads ancient history. And you repeat that over years and years and years, and faced, of course, with the ensuing revolution, which showed, if nothing else, the incompetency of the French royal government. I mean, I think that's what first puts the grain in him, that he could be another great conqueror, another great leader.
And they look constantly to the ancients, not just Napoleon, the revolutionaries also did as well, changing place names to ancient place names, changing actually sometimes their own names.
Yes.
Into ancient names. You have, of course, where he talks about 40 centuries looked down upon you at the time of the night before the Battle of the Pyramids.
If I might say so, he gets, right before the Battle of the Pyramids, he issues a declaration to his army, and he says, from these domes, from these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you. Now, one of the great mysteries of that line is that we didn't know how old the pyramids were at that time, and he guessed correctly. within a century or so. It turns out they're about 39 centuries old, right? So it's quite amazing how he was able to make that inference.
And so you, quite rightly in this book, put his great orders of the day and his proclamations and his bulletins, military bulletins, down in amongst his literary effusions.
Yes.
And they essentially did call upon the genius of France and ancient republican values, imperial values later, obviously, after he became emperor, as a way of enthusing the troops, propagandizing what he was doing, and generally trying to create a sort of historical background to his own empire.
Exactly, and this is with Napoleon such an important facet of his mind, but also of his more generally of his reign. He wants to inscribe himself in the historical record. This is a constant with him. He once said to Metternich, the great Austrian diplomat, "Your emperor, the Habsburg emperor, could lose 15 battles, and that doesn't matter to him because he has 1,000 years. That is his legitimacy. I do not have 1,000 years." He was perfectly aware that he was an upstart, and so that's where it comes from. The constant need and the reiteration to inscribe himself as the next great conqueror. Because this is the idea, right? I'm the leader, I'm the conqueror, and I govern with efficiency and victory. That's also why in his diplomacy he always sought the next great battle, because he knew the political ramifications for his reign were so huge. Some of you may know the famous painting of him crossing the Alps on a beautiful white charger that's rearing back. Complete nonsense, by the way. He crossed it at the back of the army on a donkey, covered in a shroud. But of course, being the great propagandist that he was, you might notice on the corner of that painting, he inscribes the name of the two other great generals who had crossed the Alps. Hannibal, of course, and then Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus. So the idea is I'm the next iteration of the great conqueror. And it's also, as you point out, more of a thing with the entire class, the political class of people who get to power at the time of the revolution. The reason it's a consulate, or the reason that the Council of the 500s wear these ridiculous red togas, the reason that some of the paintings of the time, everybody poses with the arm, including Napoleon, the arm inside, or people say that's because he had hemorrhoids. It is not because he had hemorrhoids. It's because the idea is that we're going back to Rome. And when you look at depictions of ancient Romans, they had to hold the arm in a certain way to keep the toga in place. The idea is we're going back to antiquity. And in fact, when he declares himself emperor, he is emperor of the French Republic. Right? So it is a completely Roman political legacy that they're trying to mimic here.
You also see that with the Senate, the creation of the Senate, and also the eagle being adopted as the standard. Yes, there's a lot of it. But I'm very interested in what you said about his meeting with Metternich in Dresden in, I think, the July of 1813, where he said, "I am the Rudolph of my dynasty."
Yes.
He's very conscious of the idea of not having the antecedents necessary. But he also he did, of course, have the King of Rome, and his love for Mary Louise and the King of Rome are evident. That's a tragic story, isn't it, where he's separated from them and isn't allowed to see them in the last 7 years of his life.
Absolutely, yeah. And in my research, but also in the Napoleonic story more generally, this is the real touching episode. This is a man who reached untold heights of glory and success, came from not exactly nothing, but unremarkable low Corsican nobility, Corsica being, as it was back then, so it is today, somewhat of a backwater. I'm sorry if I offend any Corsicans here, but really comes from unremarkable background and elevates himself to new heights, elevates France to new heights, and then loses everything. I was lucky enough to give a talk to a number of business people in London, and I asked them this very simple question: do you know of anybody in the private sector who came from absolutely nothing, who was the ultimate self-made man, who created not only a great company, but perhaps the most successful company of its time, of its generation, a man of such charisma, energy, that he captivated his entire generation, and then lost everything within a decade, to the point that he was imprisoned?
Bob Maxwell.
the Napoleon of the private sector. I think he would like that compliment on us. No, but that is just to give you an idea of the sheer drama of the story. I mean, this is a unique story in world history. If you took all the Hollywood writers together and you stuck them in a room for 1,000 years and you gave them an unlimited budget, they would not be able to write a script that would reach the ankle of what the Napoleonic story was. And of course, the end, he's separated from his wife and his son, who he can't even see. His wife is being raised as an Austrian prince. He loses the armies, he loses the empires and the kingdoms. One thing remains, and it's books. It's the same thing that was with him in the beginning. And my last chapter is called Reading into the Night, because that's very much what he does. He reads all up until the last hours of his life, and he obsesses over organizing his library, his very modest library. When he was emperor, he had a library, many libraries, which encompassed over 60,000 volumes. On St. Helena, of course, only 1,800 books served in his library. It was a major point of contention with the English, with that abominable Sir Hudson Lowe, the governor of the island.
There I agree with you. There I agree
contribution
with you.
to the world by your nation. A horrible character who refused to give Napoleon books. It was a huge reason for the deterioration of their relationship. And so up until the very end, it's the last thing that he was able to focus on and organize and lead was his modest library. And I think one of the last things he reads is the reveries of the Marshal of Saxe, for example, that Saxe himself had dictated on his deathbed. And he reads a lot of his old correspondence, almost trying to remember, trying to relive the years of glory. There's this very touching line. It's when they're on the ship, I think it's the Northumberland or the Newcastle, that's taking them to St. Helena.
Northumberland.
The Northumberland, thank you. And you can clearly tell that Napoleon, who's otherwise is so electric and motivated about pretty much everything, is very, very downtrodden, very, very fraught with anxiety at that particular time. And Las Casas says, "Worry not, sire, we will live in the past. There's plenty there to satisfy us." And that's very much what he did for the last 6 years.
And so to what extent does the memorial work? Your father, of course, was president of France. What do Frenchmen think today? It seems that there is a split between the right and left in the way that they commemorate Napoleon.
That's right. Well, in France, as in the Western world, I think we're undergoing a bit of a self-flagellating moment where other nations are allowed to have their heroes, but we're not allowed to have ours. And as soon as
how you feel, by the way.
Yes, I think England is also a prime example of that too, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And by the way, the people I've been faced on these talk shows and radio shows with about legions, millions of commentators and pundits who always come up with the same talking points. He was a warmonger, a bloodthirsty tyrant, a racist, and a sexist. But I just want to make one point to you all tonight. Nobody on the stage or in Napoleonic studies whitewashes or denies the many mistakes and crimes and the horrible sayings or deeds that he did and said. In fact, nobody studies them better than Napoleonic historians. The thing is that you can't slap a phrase on a placard and go parading in the street and think that you're going to rewrite the history of your nation. And nations have memory. Right? Without that memory, if you deny them that memory, you essentially deny them the concept of sovereignty, of historical sovereignty. It is simply essential for a people to be able to have heroes. Nobody says they have to be perfect. Napoleon himself, I mean, just the Russian expedition, the Spanish campaigns, but also the massacres of the Turkish prisoners at Jaffa, the very, very bad and disgusting sexist remarks, all of that is there. And nonetheless, he must be hoisted as one of the greatest Frenchmen and men of action in history. Right? Nobody is denying these crimes, but we must be able to still cherish our heroes. And so the left has, in my humble opinion, a lot of trouble of doing that. The problem, though, is that if we are to apply our current moral standards to figures of the past, right, who exactly passes the test? Let us open the history books and find somebody who adheres, word and letter, to every moral stance we have today. Now, if you find that guy or gal, then fine, that's somebody you can have. I reckon that person doesn't exist. And being surprised by the ill sayings of a man who was born in the 1760s, I mean, seems to me a tremendous amount of myopia and short-sightedness. Of course he said problematic things. Of course he had problematic views on slavery. Of course he went to war and caused these tremendous casualties. Look at who else populated the political sphere at that particular time. So it seems to me we're lacking the maturity to have that conversation today outside of course, serious historical departments where those conversations are ongoing.
And he also, quite a lot of the time, the left forget just straightforward facts about it, such as the fact that he abolished slavery in 1815 when he came back.
That's
and
right.
Also, of course, that many more of the wars, the 7 wars of the coalitions, were declared against him than he declared. He was responsible, of course, for the Peninsular War and the War of 1812, but not for the other 5. wars that were declared against him by the oligarchic powers.
Yeah, nor was he a dictator, as we commonly hear. If he was a dictator, so was any monarch in Europe. This man was, we know from the referendums, okay, granted, he did play around with the numbers a little bit. It was sort of a Napoleonic tendency.
Added a naught.
Yeah, a little bit. But nonetheless, we have the real numbers as well. And he was vehemently approved by the French people on multiple occasions. He was the French monarch. If he was a dictator, so was every crowned head in Europe at the time. And of course, none of them truly were.
Tell us about the Code Napoleon, not from the literary sense, because he didn't actually physically write it, of course, but nonetheless, he was able to choose which laws were going to completely revamp early 19th century France.
That's correct. And this is perhaps his most lasting legacy, and it has nothing to do with the military aspect. The man takes what were at the time over 92 discontinued and incoherent legal systems governing different provinces and cities of France, and he gets rid of all of them and uniformizes them and systematizes them into one single coherent text. Right? And this may sound simple today. The truth is that it hadn't really been done on a societal level since Justinian. And people say, oh, it's not really him who did it, it was his legal advisors. Then why did we have to wait for him in order to be able to do it? The truth is that he sat these people down, he gave them a mission, he set the course, and he gave them the political leverage to make it happen. The code is so influential, ladies and gentlemen, that over half of the Napoleonic laws are still on the text today. The code, by the way, is not just a series of articles. It is a conception of what a society should be. Right? It is the mishmash of all of the best political, philosophical, and legal thinking of the day and of times past, rendered into a single coherent document. It's so influential, in fact, that most of Europe eventually copied some aspects of it, and as far as Latin America, which to this day has a thriving Napoleonic legal tradition. So just if Napoleon was known for that facet alone, he would already take up 4 or 5 pages of your history books. But when you pepper that in with the other civil achievements and the military achievements and the literary achievements, then I think you get, despite all his faults in that man, a pretty remarkable individual.
We've got plenty of time for questions. If you put your hand up, you will be given a microphone. Lady there, and then afterwards, Natalie Livingston, the chairman of the festival.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
I'd like to ask a question about Maréchal MacDonald in a war maneuver. Okay. Because Maréchal MacDonald did not obey something, and then il était anobli. He got his title because he went against a war command of Napoleon. Yeah. What was that about?
I must confess, I'm not an expert on the military aspects of the various campaigns, and I'm not exactly sure of the. No worries at all. But I will say this: we talked a lot about his micromanaging. In terms of military achievements, it's just as well. Military campaigns, rather, it's just as well. And against Napoleon is often held the charge of the right flank during the campaign of Waterloo. Some of you may recall that he sends Grouchy to chase the Prussians and tells Grouchy to absolutely follow the Prussians no matter what happens. And of course, the Battle of Waterloo starts, and Grouchy's out there in the woods chasing the Prussians, hear the sounds of the battle, and does not rush to Napoleon's aid. He sticks, just as Napoleon had told him, right to the order. And Grouchy's often held by pretty radical Bonapartists as being the great falter, the great mistake that led to the defeat at Waterloo. But I think, as you rightfully point out, he was a man who wanted you to follow orders exactly and take no initiative whatsoever.
But he's beside Napoleon on the Musée de la Légion d'honneur. Why is MacDonald on both sides of his
I have
painting?
no idea.
It's incredible. No, I was curious. Okay.
Do you mean Marshal MacDonald the son? Sorry, do you mean the Duke of Taranto? Because he's one of the greatest marshals. He has every right to be on the Arc de He's a magnificent figure. Not least, of course, because he also has Scottish blood on his father's side. But no, he deserved his dukedom. In fact, he possibly should have got his dukedom earlier than, and his marshal's baton earlier than after the Battle of Wagram. He's a giant, as you will be reading in my forthcoming book, Napoleon and His Marshals. So, next question, Natalie Livingston.
Thank you very much for such an Interesting talks. You're clearly a great bibliophile and a passionate reader. What I'm interested in is what inspired you to look at a character like Napoleon, who's been so well documented in history, and look at him from a different perspective, that of his literature?
Sure. The honest answer is that it hadn't been done in quite a long time. And thus it was much easier to woo editors with a subject that hadn't been published in about 40 or 50 years. Now, the truth is that this subject is relatively well covered in the literature, but very parsed out. And so my work I like to think of it as one of synthesis, excuse me for mispronouncing that with my retainer on. There's been a lot of work done on the Egyptian expedition, for example, and the literary aspect of that. There's a lot of work being done on his early readings. There's a lot of work being done on his last passion, as one recent book calls it, The Last Library of St. Helena. There's also a lot of work with his relationship on Rousseau. But nowhere is there a sort of biography of his life through books, telling the whole literary arc, as I call it, of his life. That was the humble mission I set for myself. I hope all of you will tell me if it has been modestly successful.
He turns against Rousseau, though, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. So he starts off his life as one of his most loyal adherents, not only loving and reading him, but plagiarizing his work and almost everything he writes. After a while, pretty much when Napoleon decides he's going to set down the plume in favor of the sword, he knows he's not going to be a writer, and he knows in the military is going to be his future, he almost overnight abandons Rousseau. And this is very strange for a man who loved his work so much, eventually to the point that he goes to Hermonville, where Rousseau is buried. He stands over the grave of the man he had plagiarized and loved and read so often and says, history will tell whether or not that man, it would have been better for the fate of the world whether or not that man should never have been born. Exceptional thing to say for a man who had loved him and revered him so much. So the divorce with them eventually becomes completely final.
And looking at other writers who he admired and didn't, Madame de Stael.
Yes.
What's your sort of take on his spat with her?
It's one of the great missed opportunities and one of the great paradoxes of my book. I don't have an answer. I hope you will if you come around to study the subject. Napoleon was living in the beginning of his reign, in the first years of the Consulate, with some great French writers. And he, being such a great bibliophile, they seemed like natural allies, much needed allies for the time. And in fact, most of them, Chateaubriand, Benjamin Constant, Madame de Stael, love him in the beginning and do quite a lot to try to secure his good graces. He almost uniformly bungles every relationship with them and makes great enemies out of them. Now, why? Why did a man who loved books so much, who revered and honored authors so often, make great enemies out of them? Madame de Stael is a prime example. I think I can trace the deterioration of their relationship to a single moment. Madame de Stael, we know, had been stalking him. She went to Ghana to try to find him, try to corner him. He would always try to wither away from that rather weird lady. Up until to a point where, because God knows, she was a little bizarre. I'll share with you a very funny anecdote by Talleyrand afterwards, if I may. But finally corners...
No, tell us now. You can't hang us.
Fair enough. So Madame de Stael and Talleyrand had a brief affair together. And it ended rather badly. Madame de Stael was not a great beauty, not a very feminine woman in a way, quite strong and very masculine, incredibly smart, one of the great authors of the age, but nonetheless sort of lacked in feminine charm. I being the great expert, of course, of feminine charm. And so the spat with Talleyrand ends rather badly, and then Madame de Stael writes her great novel Delphine, in which Talleyrand is a character, but he is portrayed as this horrible woman. And Talleyrand learns about this and says rather offhandedly to somebody at dinner, I did not read Madame de Stael's recent books. I hear we're both disguised as women in the text. Talleyrand being well known for his wit. But the relationship deteriorates after that, I'm afraid.
Gentleman there.
Am I right in thinking that Napoleon was fairly short in stature? And if that's the case, could that explain some of his tendency to be ambitious and to compensate for that?
Perfect question.
Well,
Andrew,
listen,
being an expert...
okay, now let me... Can I answer that, please? Owing to the fact that you're quite tall. Yeah. And I am exactly the same height as Napoleon, 5'6". Yeah. And I have no plans to invade Portugal.
Yet.
So, exactly. So I don't think it necessarily follows, sir, that people of small stature are necessarily aggressive.
I will add one thing, if I may, on a rather personal note. I know another man who happens to be around 5'6" or 5'7", and who also happens to be known for his devouring energy, short temper, and gnawing ambition,
and beautiful women, including your mother,
and relationship to beautiful, and gnawing ambition. No, I will say that there's when my father was elected in 2007, there was an article by perhaps the greatest Napoleonic historian of all time, Jean Tullard, the man who created Napoleonic studies, comparing the two men. Now, having spent a little time with both, I think I'm allowed to say that there are some pretty striking similarities, not the least of which being the size. But both men have this sort of religion of action, this sort of idea that in achievement, in doing something, even if the doing is not the best possible thing, is better than deliberation, better than debate, better than figuring out the perfect plan, to just do, to set the course and go. Whether you agree with the course or not is a different subject entirely. But I think that is, apart from the size, sir, one of the great similarities between the two.
And also, if I could just say one other thing about the size.
Touchy subject,
is a touchy subject, obviously, is that he was the average height for Frenchmen of that day.
That's correct.
The reason we think of him as being so small, and if Alice Loxton is in the audience, I think she'll support me. I hope you'll support me on this, Alex, who's written the brilliant biography of James Gilray, is that the caricaturists like Gilray and Rowlandson and others deliberately made Napoleon small in order to humiliate him. And somehow he was both a monster and small, which is unusual in caricature. But the reason that we still think of him quite wrongly as being of small stature. Yeah. Next question. David Oldroyd-Bolt.
Thank you both. Thinking of another young soldier educating himself by reading the great works of military history, a man of energy and drive, who goes on to be a great war leader, Winston Churchill. Yeah. Comparing him with Napoleon, who would you say makes the greater contribution to literature, to history, and our understanding of the martial arts?
It would have to be Winston Churchill, and I say this as a Frenchman,
pleased you said that.
biting my tongue as a slight treachery to my home nation. Nonetheless, no, I think the achievements of Napoleon, despite the thesis of my book, remain civil, remain military. I mean, the impact on military science is enormous, but Winston Churchill was a Nobel Prize in literature. I think, and here I speak under your authority, obviously, but he also had this eminently readable writing style, which enthused generations of readers to this day. Napoleon, it's no such thing. I would give you a document written by Napoleon, and you'd either fall asleep or use it for something else. I mean, you would not spend a long time.
Churchill was a great admirer of Napoleon, it's worth remembering. He constantly in the Second World War differentiated Napoleon from Hitler and denounced those people who mixed those two people up. And he was somebody who collected books on Napoleon, over 100 of them that you can see at Churchill College, Cambridge today, and also believed that Napoleon's ambition, but also his audacity, were things that he himself could learn from, and he was often caricatured as Napoleon as well.
Churchill called Napoleon the greatest man of action in Europe since Julius Caesar. This is the man who faced down Hitler, so hence the comparison is pretty much dead in the water at this point. Yeah.
There's a lady there.
Thank you, Rachel. Is this on? Yeah. Sorry. You are not that keen, I gather, on Ridley Scott's film, but I wondered...
How much are you? Yes, I wonder.
But I wondered the part in it where he separates from Josephine for the good of the nation, to have an heir, etc. Yeah. How much of that particular part I'm intrigued about is based on the truth? Sure. And did he just split up with Josephine and went off with someone else rather than it being a sacrifice?
No, it had to be a rather formal and political ceremony, also a religious one. My understanding is that the public side of that depiction is rather honest and true. Of course, the great lie in that scene is that, as you may remember, he strikes Josephine in the face in the movie. Something that, to my knowledge, absolutely never happened on any scenario in any situation. So again, I think a rather despicable addition and useless addition that contributes absolutely nothing to the plot. It's just kind of thrown in there to give you a very bad image of the guy. So apart from that one caveat, my understanding is that that scene is relatively honest to the facts.
Yes, you're right about that. It was a civil ceremony that had to take place as part of French law. But, as you say, the way he's physically abusive to her is entirely invented. And also other things like having sex with her under the table when servants are present. You know, this is a man who tried to create a dignified court, a court that could look Versailles in the face and the Bourbons in the face, and which was, if anything, over punctilious when it came to nomenclature and forms of address and so on. The idea that they would then go and, you know, have sex under the table. It has to be seen on the same level as Ridley Scott's having Napoleon, there it happens again, firing at the pyramids, or leading a charge at the Battle of Waterloo, or having the Russian and Austrian armies falling through the ice at the Battle of Austerlitz. This did not happen. And as a result, you wind up with a film that has got lovely dresses and beautiful uniforms and big sort of scenes, but actually is completely worthless as history. My wife now will not go to any history movies with me. She says I'm just too pedantic. But nonetheless, with that one, it was pretty difficult not to be.
I'll give you one more scandalous act of inaccuracy in that movie, and since we're in an intimate setting, I guess I can share that particular aspect of Napoleon's life. He's a very unrealistic lover in the movie. We know that he was, unfortunately, and I'm sorry if I'm disappointing some people here, a disappointingly fast lover. We have this one rather touching example. I believe he's in Rome at the opera and is completely enamored with the lead singer and arranges for her to be brought back to the consular. That's right, to the consular apartments. Yeah. And we know this because there's an officer at the foot of the door. And so Napoleon and the singer disappear behind the double doors of the wonderful palace in Rome, and Napoleon emerges from the door exactly 3.5 minutes later, and quips to the officer something along the lines of "One makes war as one makes love." You know, a lightning strike and it's all over. So another very inaccurate part of the movie.
So David Levy, right in the middle there.
Thank you so much. I too admire a lot of what Napoleon accomplished. I'm actually wondering if in your reviews of what he has read and what he's written, if Napoleon, in your opinion, made any mistakes in terms of his interpretations and applications of what he read, whether it's ideas or practical matters.
Yeah, he absolutely did. And in fact, you can play this game on many different readings. For example, the huge emphasis placed on referendums, not only during his reign, but for the later Bonapartist political movement, may be understood as a misunderstanding of Rousseau's concept of general will. We don't know. There's not a single source that he says that he did it because of that, but it's quite actually plausible. I'll give you another one, and this is a striking and shocking example. And one of the things doing research on this book, I mean, you kind of wanted to slam your head on the table in being confounded by this mistake, is that he invades Russia while holding and while having read multiple times Voltaire's biography of Charles XII, the King of Sweden, who had himself invaded Russia in the 1740s, who had himself been faced with the strategy of attrition and luring the enemy in, who had himself been faced with a destructive winter, and who had been destroyed in the middle of Russia. He has the book, Napoleon does, with him in the Kremlin. He reads it and talks about it to his marshals in the Kremlin, and yet does not heed any of the warnings that it so evidently exclaimed. Now, why he did not, despite Caulaincourt incessantly repeating to him that this was a terrible and a tragic mistake, is anyone's guess. But this is just another amazing moment of sight blindness from Napoleon.
I think another example would be his belief in Ossian. He assumed that Ossian, this ancient Celtic poet, had written the bardic works, and in fact it was a down at heel Soho writer who had forged them, James Macpherson, and he would ask writers, when he met British writers, he would say, was it James Macpherson or was it Ossian? And he knew reams of Ossian by heart. He loved Ossian. He bought paintings in which Ossian, scenes from Ossian were depicted and so on. So that's another thing where he fell, by the way, along with the whole of the rest of Europe at that time, for the great literary hoax of Ossian. Next question. Gentleman there.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any of your own theories about Waterloo, because in terms of writing and Napoleon's writing, because as you've described, he was very literary, he wrote a great number of messages, he was very into detail. Yeah. Yet on that day, his ability seemed to have failed him. The messages he was sending out were contradictory and confusing and ultimately led to his own defeat. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts as to why that happened.
Absolutely. In fact, I postulate that if we had the young general of the first Italian campaign see the performance of the aging emperor at Waterloo, he would not recognize himself. And in fact, when many historians say that they like Napoleon, they very much mean one Napoleon. And this was a very polyvalent man who was many different things at different times. Some people, like Thierry Lenz of the Fondation Napoleon, for example, really focus on the first 2 years of the consulate. Charles-Éloi Vial focuses on the last years and the downfall. These are completely different characters. When it comes to Waterloo specifically, for example, one of the most well-known facets of the battle is that he waits for the ground to dry in order to begin his attack, so-called because he wanted the cannonballs to be able to ricochet off of the ground and not barrow itself because it had been raining for the night before. But if you were to tell 27 to 28-year-old Napoleon, let's wait till 11 a.m. to start the attack, he would have clawed you at your throat. What are you talking about? The man was all energy, all conviction, all movement. So this is one of the assets is completely unrecognizable. I think another is not proper concentration of force. As I mentioned earlier, he sends Grouchy on that goose chase, and the Prussians are allowed to keep him at bay. Had the right wing, and not only had Grouchy been there, but had Davout, the best marshal who was mistakenly left in Paris as Minister of War for reasons that pass understanding, was commanding the right wing, perhaps we'd have a very different battle indeed.
If you want to go into any more detail on this, I've written a book on Waterloo, and it costs about 16p now, irritatingly. But there we go.
Wonderful book.
Yeah, thank you. Sweet of you. Thanks very much. I
Wonderful,
appreciate that.
wonderful
We've got 3 more minutes. I'm going to ask for maybe the last question, if there's anybody who would like to ask Louis anything else. There we go, gentleman there. And then, but before you ask the question, can I remind everybody that Louis' excellent book, really excellent book, is going to be for sale at John Sandow on the other side.
At a very affordable price, you'll find.
Right, sir.
Thank you for coming. Do you think that sort of Napoleon's relationship with literature, sort of shutting himself off in the foliage and sort of reading books at military school, do you think that contributed to a sense in his later life that he was, apart from other men and separated from them, and was sort of a kind of romantic relationship of literature that kind of fueled the sense that he was destined for a greater purpose?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It would be unfair for me to say that he was the only young guy who had ever read history books and didn't think he was special. I think many, many young individuals do that. Not pointing any fingers. But many men of his generation felt the same way. The difference is that with him, literature was not some childhood phase in which he read about great heroes. It was all-encompassing. Almost an addiction, and followed him his entire life. I mean, specifically, for example, when it comes to novels, we have these surreal scenes. When he's presiding over a battle, tens of thousands of casualties, cannonballs ricocheting through the air, blood, gore everywhere, people barking orders, and he retires into his tent to read a love novel about one of Marie Antoinette's ladies in waiting. And his subordinates, so this is clearly, his passion was incredibly present at multiple stages of his life, which was unique. And of course, his many readings of history and of great men cemented in his the idea that he could do the same. he says himself, a rather offhanded remark, he says two of them. One, it's after the First Italy, he says, that's when I realized that I could do something very special, that I could be one of the race that creates empires, is his line. And the other, he's talking to a few marshals, I don't exactly know when, I think it's in 1810 or 1811, and he makes a remark as in, but you people wouldn't understand. And the key is, okay, who does he mean by you people? Does he mean the marshals? Or does he mean the rest of humanity bar him? And I think that's more accurate. I think the man was so unique and so different in many ways, and so aware of his own uniqueness, that he considered himself completely alone, a complete alien. In fact, he probably had very little friends. We may disagree on this point. I've heard you talk about the subject, but I mean, he makes these very, very amoral remarks right after the deaths of some of his best friends, people who, if we lost and had the same relationship, would be destroyed. With him, he very much moves on. Pierre Simon de Laplace, for example, loses his daughter and comes up to the emperor, "Sire, I've lost my daughter." And he says, "Bah, you are a mathematician, put this in an equation, you see it will amount to zero." Right? Not exactly something to say to a grieving father. It's a very bizarre relationship to other human beings. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree that we've got a very exciting new voice in the world of history writing. Hello, and well done.
Thank you, sir.